got to be mutual. Not only the community trusting the law enforcement officers, but also the law enforcement officers trusting the people that they're sworn to protect and serve. Because if you're a police officer, the only people that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis are the criminals in your community, you start to develop a psychological and emotional profile of the community that you're policing. So those trust-building activities, those trust-building efforts and initiatives have to be mutual. They have to facilitate the law enforcement officers also trusting the people and communities that they serve.
This is the Reverend Markel Hutchins joining us. He's the president and CEO of Movement Forward. If I may ask, who funds your organization?
So we're funded primarily by corporate dollars. We have some private foundation dollars. We get some government grants as well. So we're funded through a diversity of streams.
Is law enforcement part of that funding stream?
So no, we don't really get any funding from law enforcement. We have relationships and partnerships with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Sheriff's Association. Literally every national law enforcement organization in this country is a partner of ours, but they don't fund our work. We like to try to maintain a degree of separation between our partnerships and our funders.
We have some calls lined up for you. This is from Debbie starting us off. She's in Georgia for our guest. Debbie, good morning. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I actually wanted to comment on your comment, sir, that defunding the police in terms of a philosophy was fundamentally flawed. What we really had determined is that it was just a poor message and maybe a poor choice of language and not necessarily a flawed philosophy. So when you say it's fundamentally flawed, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is exactly what you articulated. I believe all of us think that do this work nationally, that there's got to be some reallocation of resources. We need to invest more in alternatives to incarceration. We need to invest more in support for people who are in the criminal justice system that are mentally challenged or have some other sort of emotional or psychological challenges. But to take resources away from law enforcement is fundamentally flawed. I don't disagree with her underlying proposition that it was the wording, the messaging, but that matters greatly. When you say defund the police, that inherently means taking something away. We need to support and increase funding for law enforcement, but we also need to support and expand, if you will, and supplement their efforts at crime reduction and not supplant them through programs that take away resources from law enforcement. And so I on some level, I agree with her underlying premise. Yeah.
Do you think that movement took off? Do you think it died down? What was the overall impact?
Well, I think that it took off, but I think it was an overreaction, if you will, an effort to overcorrect some of the gross injustices like George Floyd that we've seen in this country, but it has quickly died down. And you see in cities like San Francisco and Denver and other places where the defund the police movement really took off, and folks are starting to roll those things back. Even in Portland, Oregon, we saw very recently that some of the efforts and some of the most prominent voices within the criminal justice system that promoted defund the police were summarily dismissed from office. So I think now the majority of the American people are beginning to see that our pathway forward in this country around police injustices is not to supplant or to remove resources from law enforcement, but to find other ways to support and supplement our nation's law enforcement efforts.
Massachusetts is where Matt is for our guest. Matt, go ahead.
Good morning. There's so much to say. The fact that we're even squabbling over the word defund and creating a specter as if we're going to lower, funding of police officers in this country is kind of laughable. As I see SWAT cars rolling through Cambridge, Massachusetts on the daily. There's a lot to say. Thank you for the guest. I think you're doing something really productive here. There's two sides. There's the public and there's the police officers. And treating this equation as, two separate entities is not going to work. And I think the police officers in this country are rotten to the core. And that's a big problem. And that's probably the root of the problem. So to treat this as a public versus police officer thing almost detracts from the core of the issue here, which is there's a culture of rot in police officers across this entire country, and I've seen it. It's a good old boys club. Just in the last year, if you look at the Massachusetts State Police records, there's multiple major corruption cases. And I've worked with these guys in construction, across multiple industries. I see them every day twiddling their phones in construction, yelling at people because they have their heads in their phones, the police officers, as they're, supposed to be directing traffic, and then they get angry when someone doesn't do what they say. These guys will obfuscate everything they can. They're the they have the least integrity of any profession that I've worked with. Doctors, academia, construction guys, landscapers.
Okay, caller, but for all that said, what would you like to direct to our guest? What question? What's the question?
What question? What are we going to do to turn this focus on a culture of rot within the police institutions in this country instead of turning it on the public?
Okay, Massachusetts, thanks.
So I think, Pedro, we have to make a determination. Are we going to continue to curse the darkness, or are we going to light a candle? I'm not familiar with the culture of rot, as he put it. I am familiar with a culture in law enforcement that needs changing, that needs innovation. We have to shift our nation's law enforcement culture away from a guardian or from a servant or from a warrior mentality to more of a guardian and servant mentality. The warrior mentality, I think, is perhaps what this gentleman is referencing. And we have to change that. But we cannot do so if we're reduced to yelling and screaming at one another and overgeneralizing. Are there bad and corrupt law enforcement officers? Yes. Just as there are bad and corrupt doctors and lawyers and judges and politicians, etc. But I believe that most law enforcement officers, the vast majority, get into the profession to serve the community. I've met them. We partner with them across this country. So this overarching thing that somehow the institution of policing is corrupt, I think is absolutely incorrect. And I think every time that we use our voices to demonize law enforcement, we drive the culture and the divisions of separation even further into the American ethos. We have to make a determination. Are we going to curse the darkness, or are we going to light a candle? And I've decided to light a candle.
You've mentioned the murder of George Floyd. At that time, widespread calls from Capitol Hill for changes and reform. Ultimately, what came out of all that?
Well, I think what came out of it is not a whole lot, frankly. I think what came out of much of it was a historic spike in crime and violence, because there was a mass wave and exodus of people in law enforcement. We have continued to see struggles in law enforcement agencies, efforts to recruit and attract, particularly a diverse police workforce, if you will. So one of the things that I think was an unintended consequence of a lot of the calls for reform and change, et cetera, and believe me, there's certainly reformation needed in law enforcement, but it cannot be based on demonization and division. We need to innovate. We need to hold police officers accountable when they make bad decisions, or when they make mistakes that cost people their lives. But the overarching theme, I think, that came from much of the calls for change was a historic spike in crime and violence, because we did not, as a nation, approach the issue curatively and broadly or holistically. Crime and violence has got to be at the center of our discussions about how we change, transform, and reform law enforcement.
Here's Richard. Richard is in Augusta, Georgia. Go ahead. You're next up.
Good morning, Reverend.
Good morning.
My situation is, my brother in 1968 was shot and killed by a police officer. Nothing in Chester, Pennsylvania. My question is, do you look into situations where you investigate old cases like my brother's, and to try to get reforms done along that line? And also, do you address the issue of qualified immunity in the Senate and Congress? So it's a two-part question. Do you investigate the situation like my brother in 1968 in Chester, Pennsylvania, and also address the issue of qualified immunity dealing with Senator Tim Scott?
First of all, let me first say that I know it was a long time ago, but I'm sorry that this loss ever happened to you and your family. Certainly feel free to reach out to us. They will put our contact information on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us. We're always interested in civil rights and social justice matters. And we've got some relationships with folks in Pennsylvania that may be able to help take a look at your brother's death. As far as qualified immunity, that is one of the most critical challenges that we face in this country when it comes to holding law enforcement accountable and responsible. We really need to take a better, more comprehensive look at how we create immunity, or how we allow police officers and sheriff's deputies, law enforcement broadly, to get away with certain things that they should not be allowed to get away with. So I think the conversations around qualified immunity are probably the most critical that we can have from a public policy standpoint. Most of the challenges as we see them with police and communities are public culture related that cannot be fixed by public policy. But on the issue of qualified immunity, the Congress of the United States and state legislatures across this country really need to take a second look at how we allow police officers to, how qualified immunity applies to law enforcement officers, because oftentimes it's used as a tool for injustice against families that have been victimized by police violence.
Our conversation with Reverend Markel Hutchins. He's with Movement Forward. He's the president and CEO. He's also the lead organizer and CEO of the National Faith of Blue Weekend. Don joins us from New Orleans. Good morning. You're next up.
So I'll take the swing at it. Good morning to you, and the good Reverend.
Good morning.
Yes, sir. I was looking at the title, Police and Community Engagement. Commune to commune. I know you know about communion, Ralph. Have a communion. And so my question is, when you talk about the prospect of law enforcement as people, as personnel, let's not look at policy so much. Let's look at law enforcement as people serving in law enforcement. Where do they derive from? Are they coming from? What community do they come from? And what civic engagement that these citizens of these communities have, especially when you talk about low voter turnout, low registration. We are not, we're a community. A community has everything it needs to thrive and survive. Businesses and everything, churches. But we're not civically engaged. We're not voting. We have for instance, we have outdated laws on the books. And we have people in Louisiana, now you have birth control pills. You'll be criminalized for having birth control pills. Oh, the whole legislative process of community and civic engagement, I think, is the real issue. How do we engage people civically, and how do we engage people to their civic duty of voting and even running viable candidates out of our communities?
Gotcha, Don. Thank you.
Well, I think Don raises some excellent points. First of all, police and community have to be the same. We can no longer treat law enforcement as a separate entity in our community, but they're not the only responsible parties for ensuring a vibrant or vital or vibrant community, if you will. Every community-based organization should be engaged in issues around public safety, like faith-based organizations, civic organizations, athletic and sporting organizations, particularly recreation leagues and those kinds of groups, should be engaged with public safety to create an environment where the community thrives. So I think he's right. Faith-based, I'm a big proponent, Pedro, as you have articulated, of faith-based organizations getting involved with law enforcement to be goodwill ambassadors and bridge builders between civic organizations and community residents with law enforcement. As long as police officers treat people in communities as somehow separate from their own community, we'll continue to see these tragic deaths like George Floyd and Tyre Nichols and others. When Tyre Nichols was killed in Memphis, Pedro, one of the things that I said on your program and other programs is it was not excusable, but it was explainable. The police officers that killed Tyre Nichols in Memphis were African-American. Tyre Nichols was African-American. But the police officers have been dealing with such high crime and violence in Memphis for so long that they had become desensitized to the suffering of the people in their communities, to the point that they just saw Tyre Nichols as another one of the people in their own community that did not deserve to be treated humanely. So they have developed, in a lot of instances, police officers have developed psychological and emotional profiles because they're dealing only with the criminals in their communities, which is why I think what the gentleman raises is so important. We have to create some psychological and emotional balance for police officers, both in terms of what they receive from their law enforcement agencies, from their academy, their training, etc., but also from their engagement with community organizations.
We have a viewer, Gus, from Brooklyn, asking what you think about residency requirements for police officers.
Well, I think it's difficult. I think ideally we'd love to see more law enforcement officers live in the communities that they serve and protect, but to require that, I think, is a bit of a logistical challenge. We still see in this nation police departments are overwhelmingly suffering from a staffing shortage. There is really a crisis in America today with regard to police not having enough people interested in choosing careers in law enforcement. We see major cities like Washington, D.C., where we are today, Chicago, Atlanta, where I live. Most major cities are down hundreds of law enforcement officers. So to require police officers to live in those communities would just be a further complication for efforts to attract and retain talent. But I think ideally it would be wonderful if police officers live in the communities that they serve.
Do the law enforcement officers that you engage with say things to the effect of they're maybe hesitant to do their jobs because of attention that was paid to the aftermath of George Floyd or Tyree Nichols, or the presence of cell phone cameras or body cameras? Has it made the job difficult for them to engage?
Yeah, it's made it difficult in the communities that are most exposed to the vestiges of segregation and Jim Crow and injustice broadly are the ones that suffer the most. Communities of color disproportionately suffer when law enforcement officers don't do their job, which is why I was so concerned by the calls to defund the police, the demonization of law enforcement. Pedro, I have been at the forefront. I've led some of the largest police involved demonstrations as a result of police violence, and I've led marches from one side of this country to the other. But our best march today is not against law enforcement, it's towards law enforcement. We have to perfect policing and not demonize it, because the number one, I think, outcome of the George Floyd crisis was law enforcement officers left the profession and crime and violence escalated as a result.
From Washington State, we'll hear from Earl. Go ahead, you're on.
Well, Rev, I'm an ex-Marine, and one of the things that they drill in you from the time you get to Paris Island is that civilians are garbage, and they draw police from the military in the disproportionate numbers, but that civilians are garbage mentality stays with you the rest of your life.
I don't know about that one.
I'm not familiar with the training that he's referencing, or the teaching that civilians are garbage. What I can tell you is there is some challenge around police officers who are former military, because there is it's a different proposition, but there is, the reality is that we've got to figure out how to deprogram officers that used to be professional military personnel, because I think, I don't know about the garbage thing that he's referencing, but there are some challenges for police officers that used to be in the military, because they were dealing with people in very different situations and people in the communities that they should be serving.
Again, viewers, if you want to ask questions of our guests for the Eastern and Central time zones, it's 202-748-8000. For the Mountain and Pacific time zones, it's 202-748-8001. And if you are a member of law enforcement and you want to give your perspective, 202-748-8002 is the number to call. A viewer asked from X this morning, whatever happened to community engagement programs like Coffee with a Cop, the DARE program in the schools and the like, adding that these are examples of some programs that join police officers with their community.
Well, those programs still very much exist. In fact, earlier this month, our organization hosted a national training conference called the Professionalizing Law Enforcement Community Engagement Training. We're very proud to partner with the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and again, most of the national law enforcement organizations, because I think everybody recognizes that we need to, again, get back to focusing on these positive programs like Coffee with a Cop, like National Night Out, like DARE and the Police Athletic Leagues and Faith and Blue Weekend that really focus the attention away from the divisions and the dissensions, not to sweep them under the carpet or to somehow deny that George Floyd should never have been killed, that Tyree Nichols was a reality, but also to focus on what we can do to prevent those tragedies from happening. So those programs still very much exist. They were part of our conference. What we have allowed is, again, the vocal minority to monopolize the conversation and not allow enough attention to be placed on how we actually cure the problems of police community engagement issues instead of just highlighting the divisions, if you will.
We have a viewer who asks you, why do you breeze over the notion of holding police accountable while detailing the need to control community response to police abuse?
Because, well, first of all, I do not. And the truth of the matter is there's not been many people in this country who have advocated for police accountability any more aggressively than I have. And I continue to do so. I just understand that our pathway forward is not to just focus on the divisions or the dissensions. When police officers make mistakes, for example, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, the president of the Fraternal Order of Police, Patrick Yost, was a good friend of mine, called me. We had a conversation about what the Fraternal Order of Police should do. The next week or so, the FOP came out in a historic statement and called George Floyd's death a murder. The truth of the matter is, marching and protesting still is very much necessary, but our best march at this moment, because crime and violence is an essential issue in our communities. One of the things, Pedro, that kind of frustrates me is people talk about social justice issues only when it comes to police-related violence. We've got to deal with police violence, but I, for one, I'm tired of preaching the funerals and burying young people in communities that die as a result of community-based violence. So for every one issue that people like me who are in ministry, that are in civil rights, that are in social justice, for every one police-involved tragedies, we have 10 community-based issues or community violence-based challenges that we have to address. So it's incumbent upon us to not just focus on police violence. We've got to focus on that, but we've got to increase the spotlight on community-based violence, and law enforcement is a central part of how we reduce community-based violence in this country.
Let's hear from Dale. Dale is in Michigan. Dale, good morning.
Name is Dave, yes.
Oh, Dave, I'm sorry.
Give him a new name.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, my dad used to be a deputy back in the 60s and 70s, and I don't know whatever happened to a lot of the deputies that used to ride with the police, number one. Number two is, do you think it would be a good idea for the townships or the county to designate maybe 3 hours of maybe once a week to ride with a police officer to see what the communities actually need and enlighten them and both sides of what we need to get a grip on and so on, and because they're going to end up doing community service anyway if you get in trouble. I was a youngster that if I got in trouble, my dad didn't want to hear about it. You know what I'm saying? So I think my answer off the air, Rob. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. I think that
His name is Reverend Markel Hutchins. Reverend Markel Hutchins with the Movement Forward is a president of CEO of Movement Forward. It is a police and community engagement is what they're talking about this morning here on the Washington Journal.
Police officers should be required to spend time in the schools, to spend time in the faith-based organizations, to spend time with civic and community groups. As a part of their annual training, they should be required to be connected to the communities, because that's the only way that they'll ever be able to police effectively and certainly police justly and equitably.
As far as oversight of how a department conducts itself and how officers conduct themselves, what kind of oversight do you think is needed on an individual or a police by precinct level?
It has to be community driven. Oversight, it has to be community focused. The oversight has to include people in law enforcement, perhaps even some advocates for law enforcement, but it has to be community driven, community focused, and community based. The oversight that we've seen in a lot of states that are driven by politicians and politics have really been advantageous only to a small minority of people, but to have really the benefits of oversight, it has to be community driven for law enforcement.
What degree does the Justice Department get involved in oversight issues?
Well, I think the Justice Department should get involved when there is a crisis or a challenge that cannot be perfected by local communities. Local communities, in my estimation, Pedro, have the answer. The Justice Department certainly has a responsibility to ensure that civil and human rights are protected at every level. But I think if we're going to really see effective, non-resistant oversight in communities, it has to be driven by local communities and local community representatives.
Let's hear from Moore. Moore is in Georgia for our guest, Markel Hutchins. Go ahead, you're on.
Good morning, C-SPAN. I call myself an old man. I'm 76, and I look at the police different. I grew up under Jim Crow in Louisiana, but in '68, I never got over this. It was a ride at the prison in Long Beach jail. It was a prison in a comeback zone, and it was 90% filled with people that looked like me, black. I've been picked up and taken to jail twice by police, one on the day that I retired from the military, and 1 year in Georgia, because I didn't know nothing about it. Everybody in the car goes to jail, and somebody got something nobody knows who belongs to. So my theory of the police, there are good police. I did this police for 6 months. I could stop being a police because of the way they were treating them people. So there are good police. There are bad police. And I understand because when they are in the community, standing on the corner, and I always tell folks, I do not believe that those young men would stand on the corner if they had to get up tomorrow morning and go to work, making at least enough money they can buy themselves a car. I just don't believe they would do that. So my whole thing, the police is right now a authority thing. If I say move, you move. It's a dominion. I'm giving you direct order. You can only get direct orders in the military. It's a
Okay, caller, apologies for that.
He cut him off. And he acted like it was an apology, but it wasn't. In America, if you are black, you are given a direct order. If you fail to comply, I promise you, you will die from law enforcement. And that's what I have witnessed in my 65 years of being a citizen here on this planet.
You got his point across. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we have to change exactly what he's saying, which is why our focus organizationally and what the work that we're doing, even within law enforcement, I also serve on the national board of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. It's the organization in this nation that honors law enforcement officers that have fallen. And a lot of people ask me, why as a civil rights person, why as an African-American minister that has been involved in civil rights, why are you working so closely with law enforcement? And the answer is because that's how we're going to change things. We can no longer simply yell and scream at each other. And we have to draw close enough to actually be able to change the culture within law enforcement. What he's talking about is a culture that I call a warrior-based culture within law enforcement. And we have to change that to a servant-based culture, but we cannot do so if we're not in relationships and sitting around the table of sisterhood and brotherhood and actually talking through how we make changes, how we make transformations in communities. In public safety. Dr. King used to say we should be the change that we want to see in the world. I encourage more young people, let's not just, again, curse the darkness. Let's light a candle. Let's become law enforcement officers. Let's become prosecutors and judges that will ensure a more just and equitable criminal justice system. We can continue to march and riot on the street, but ultimately that's not what's going to change things. What's going to change things is when we have a police force in this country, when we have judges and prosecutors that look like the communities, that think like the communities where these community members live. That's what's going to change.
To the last, another viewer off of X saying, how about the community speaking respectfully to law enforcement officers?
That's a joke.
It goes both directions. Certainly community, but the truth is most community members understand that law enforcement is imperfect, but law enforcement does a good job every single day. People ask me again, why so much partnership with law enforcement? Why do you support law enforcement so much? My mother is 76 years old, like one of our last callers. And when something happens in our family, when a crisis happens in any community, we have to pick up the phone and call 911.
And when you do that, a lot of black people die.
For us to perfect the people that respond to our crises as opposed to demonizing them. I want every police officer in this country to be mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually well. Because when they're well, they treat people well.
Let's hear from Michael. Michael in Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Reverend.
Good morning.
I think you're an honorable man. I would like you to investigate the George Floyd, as you call, murder. He wasn't murdered. He died from fentanyl.
Everybody got a...
The coroner said he did not die from asphyxiation. I appreciate you having me. Thank you. Have a good day.
Even if he was on fentanyl, he was on it by himself. He didn't need an officer choking him.
North Carolina. Hi there.
Good morning, C-SPAN, and good morning, Reverend Hutchins.
Good morning.
I wanted to piggyback off the guy in Louisiana that was speaking on community involvement, trying to get people more involved in their own process. And I wanted to speak to the fact that, yes, I appreciate what you're doing, but I believe it's a real big mountain to climb because there's so many other elements that play within the policing situation. We have an increase in population. We have an increase in, an overload of drug involvement. We have an overload of just homelessness, and all that's contributed back to drugs and everything in the community. And so I'm thinking that that's a big mountain to climb. There's so many agencies out here trying to do an effectual change, but until the community works directly with the police departments and be a change of their own, I don't really see anything happening.
Okay, Carolyn, thank you.
It's interesting because I suppose that 50 years ago, when Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy and Joseph Lowry and Jesse Jackson and so many other people that impacted my life were fighting against the Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, that people told them, I'm sure, that it's too big of a mountain to climb. But the truth is that there is nothing that we cannot solve if we have the courage and capacity to work collaboratively. And it has to happen here in our nation's capital. It has to happen in state legislatures. It has to happen on city councils and county commissions, but it also has to happen in local communities. Every church, every mosque, every synagogue, every athletic league, every recreational center has got to focus their attention on public safety, on crime and violence, on creating an environment where public safety is co-produced by communities and by law enforcement together. We certainly cannot overlook the drivers of crime, which also drive police violence. There is a lot of despair and desperation in our communities, a lot of a lack of opportunities for young people. We have to continue, as I believe this young lady is suggesting, investing in programming that gives kids an opportunity when they come from the most depressed situations, that gives them some options other than just crime. So I think, as she suggests, we have to have a holistic and broad approach to how we solve the problem of police violence. And simply focusing on sending corrupt officers to jail is inadequate. It is necessary, but it is inadequate. We have to look more broadly. and building goodwill, building partnerships between law enforcement at every level, from the U.S. Department of Justice down to the smallest police department, is an essential and key element of how we promote justice and fairness in this country.
Reverend Markel Hutchins of the National Faith in Blue Weekend and Movement Forward, faithinblue.org is one of the websites you can find his work. Thanks for giving us your time today.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
Coming up in about a half hour from now, we're going to be joined by the former New York Lieutenant Governor Betsy McCoy. She's the chair of the Committee to Reduce Infectious Deaths. We'll talk about efforts to combat healthcare-acquired infections and the overall state of healthcare. But first, before that, open forum. And you can participate by calling 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll take those calls, and Washington Journal continues.
Today, an unprecedented armada landed on the shores of Normandy.
These are the boys of Pointe du Hope. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war.
2 million sons from 15 countries jumped into flak-filled skies and a blood-soaked surf and met death on an even plain.
The sons of democracy improvised and mounted their own attacks. At that exact moment, on these beaches, the forces of freedom turned the tide of the 20th century.
That road to VE Day was hard and long and traveled by weary and valiant men. And history will always record where that road began. It began here with the first footprints on the beaches of Normandy.
And more than 150,000 souls set off toward this tiny sliver of sand upon which hung more than the fate of a war, but rather the course of human history.
Today we remember those who fell and we honor all who fought right here in Normandy.
Watch C-SPAN's live all-day special coverage of the 80th anniversary of D-Day, Thursday, June 6th, featuring a speech by President Biden from Normandy, France.
Washington Journal continues.
Again, it's open forum, and if you want to participate on the phone lines, call the line that best represents you. And if you've called in the last 30 days, if you would hold off from doing so today, we would appreciate it. You can also text us to your thoughts, 202-748-8003. Bill in Georgia, Republican line, you're first up on this open forum. Good morning.
I'd just like to comment on the justice's wife flying the flag upside down. That's usually a sign of distress. And has anyone ever thought that she might be distressed by all the Secret Service people or the U.S. Marshals that have to follow her all day to protect her? Has anyone ever thought about the protester who go around her house and threaten her and her children all day, and nothing is done by the Justice Department to arrest these people because they're going against the law? They should be arrested. Mrs. Alito may be just scared, and that's why she's in distress, and that's why she's flying the flag upside down. Has anyone ever thought about what she is feeling? She might be just plain scared, and that's the reason, more than likely, why she flies the flag upside down.
Okay.
She did it knowing that this would be a controversy, but she herself feels scared. No one seems to give a darn about a woman who is in danger.
Bill in Georgia there. This is Gary in Dayton, Ohio, Democrats line.
Hi, Pedro. Yeah. I wanted to comment on the fact that the thing that happened in Louisiana with they classified the abortion pills as a Schedule I narcotic, I think. And I want to know if anything happened with that. And I just would put that out there, like some of these Democratic states that are out there, they should put out they should try to make chocolate and caffeine a Schedule I narcotic, because those things are far more addictive.
Okay, Gary there in Ohio. A couple things to let you know today that are happening outside of Washington, D.C. There's a special session that will take place today in Ohio, the Ohio legislature, but it's called by Governor Mike DeWine to change an election law deadline so that President Biden can be on the fall ballot and to ban foreign contributions to ballot issue campaigns. Since 1935, state lawmakers have been called into special sessions by governors 27 times, the most recent in 2024, and 7 times no law was passed out of those sessions. But DeWine says he wants his fellow Republicans who have the supermajority to move on the foreign money ban and the fix to ensure that President Biden is on the ballot this November. I've been patient. My patience has run out, and I think the patience of the people of the state of Ohio and their patience should have run out by as well, he said in a press call about this special session. You can see that more there taking place in Ohio. Also in Texas today, there'll be anticipated, according to The Hill, primary election runoffs that are guaranteed to make waves as Governor Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton look to finally shut the door on the political careers of a select group of vulnerable Republicans who have wronged them in the past year. Abbott has taken aim this election cycle at the Republican incumbents who voted against the signature school voucher program. Paxton is targeting the Republicans who voted to impeach him, and along with Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, Abbott and Paxton targeted a slate of 16 Republican lawmakers who defied them, pouring money into their opponents' campaigns and rallying with them in the week since. So look for those to play out in the various states as the electoral process continues on. You can comment on that if you want in open forum. Jim in Connecticut, Independent Line.
Hello, Pedro. I've got made some notes here about what I'm thinking, so here it is. Regarding the general election in November, first, whatever happens and whoever wins, there's no reason to blame election officials or election workers. They're a cross-section of our population. We're generally fair-minded, decent people. I have to say that because after the last general election, they became targets of harassment and threats. And I think it's crucial that our leaders, including members of Congress, answer when asked if they will stand by the election results. And I must give credit here to Senator Graham for saying that he would, although he added the caveat, as long as there's no cheating. But when any members of Congress refuse to answer that question, they, as leaders and examples to others, malign the process as well as the people who've taken the task of conducting it. I have searched the internet looking for an incident where an election worker witnessed a suspicious action during the last general election. I looked for news of a whistleblower among our nation's election workers and found nothing. And this makes me wonder if anyone has asked if it's possible to direct a conspiracy to rig the presidential election and still have not a single person working at the thousands of polls across America get wind of it and blow the whistle on it. Keep in mind, too, that the votes among election workers themselves are split between Democrats and Republicans. So I think we might be jeopardizing our own system for both sides if we don't withstand what I believe is a baseless mistrust. And I think it's high time our leaders took responsibility to help get back on track by answering when asked if they'll stand by the election results.
Okay. Ken is in Michigan. Independent Line. Hello.
Hello?
You're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, this thing about the Supreme Court flying a flag upside down is so ridiculous it shouldn't even have comment. But there are bigger things going on. We have the last person on the Supreme Court can't even decide if it's a woman or a man. How are they going to decide major decisions that we need decided on? And is she going to recluse himself or whatever it is? Is she going to recluse from any male or female's decisions?
Okay, Ken in Michigan. Again, it's open forum. Participate by calling the lines. You can post on line 2 at the various sites, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, Independents, 748-8002. One of the things to look out for today in New York City, this from the Wall Street Journal writing that a jury of 5 women and 7 men in Donald Trump's hush money trial is expected to begin this week the historic task of deciding whether to convict a former president, a verdict that could set the tone for an election year that's already turned off many voters. Mr. Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, so far has emerged largely unscathed from his trial on 34 felony charges, but a conviction would be an ignominious first for a former president, threatening Mr. Trump's standing with some voters and handling President Biden new ammunition to portray his rival as unfit for office. An acquittal or even a hung jury could be a career-defining moment for Trump, who likely would cast himself as having vanquished an improper political prosecution. Again, watch out for that and more coming out of New York City today. We'll hear from Frank in Long Island, Independent Line.
Hey, Pedro, good morning. I agree with the previous caller. The whole flag issue is really a non-issue. I don't understand why we're spending so much time on it when there are so many more important things to do, to talk about. But you showed a segment earlier of don't know who he was, a segment taken from MSNBC, who in my opinion is probably the most divisive political news organization that there is, intended solely to divide us, not unite us. But specifically, the congressman or whoever he was that was speaking, my point is simply this. When you are stating a point and inject the word MAGA, I think he said MAGA flags, which is absolutely ridiculous. When you inject that word into the conversation, anything you say after that, I think, is immediately dismissed by me. Because it clearly shows who you are, nothing more than a partisan hack, not somebody who is willing to work together with people. We need to unite and not be divided. Thank you very much.
Frank, there in Long Island, as part of the events of Memorial Day yesterday, President Biden heading to Arlington National Cemetery. One of his roles as president lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, which several presidents of many administrations have done over the course of time as part of their presidential duties. You can see more of those events as you're seeing right now on our website at C-SPAN and our app at C-SPAN Now. It was also yesterday, as part of the activities there, that President Biden made comments about the day. Here they are.
Decade after decade, tour after tour, these warriors fought for our freedom and the freedom of others. Because freedom has never been guaranteed. Every generation has to earn it, fight for it, defend it in battle between autocracy and democracy, between the greed of a few and the rights of many. It matters. Our democracy is more than just a system of government. It's the very soul of America. It's how we've been able to constantly adapt through the centuries. It's why we've always emerged from every challenge stronger than we went in. It's how we come together as one nation, united. And just as our fallen heroes have kept the ultimate faith with our country and our democracy, we must keep faith with them. I've long said we have many obligations as a nation. We only have one truly sacred obligation: to prepare those we send to the battle, and to take care of them and their families when they come home. To ensure the burden is no longer on them to prove their illness was service-related, whether it was Agent Orange or toxic waste. To ensure they protected them, they just have to protect the United States because it is assumed that their death was a consequence of the exposure. On this day, we came together again to reflect, to remember, but above all, to recommit to the future they fought for, a future grounded in freedom, democracy, opportunity, and equality.
More from the president available at the app, the website, and online if you want to see that for yourself. We'll hear from Charles. He's in Florida, Democrats line.
Hey, how you doing, sir?
You're on. Go ahead.
All right. I would just appeal to everyone to just reach down and deep inside and appeal to their better angels. I think the people who are getting paid and cashing very big checks are enjoying to see us divided. We need to just reach in and find some decency within ourselves and stand for what's right, period. No matter what political party you're affiliated with, we all know right from wrong. And I think we should stand together and stop being fooled by people with interests that just simply for themselves, period. That's all I have to say.
People such as who?
Well, there's, whether it's media, like, for example, I used to really, really enjoy listening to this show because it was listening to my neighbors, my fellow Americans. But unfortunately, we're being fooled by lies and things that just are not true. And I think deep down inside, we all know what's right and what's wrong. And we have way more in common than we do differences. I think we just need to stand together, be better better citizens and civilians, and do what's right and stand for what's right.
From Anthony. Anthony in Virginia, Republican line on this open forum. Go ahead.
Yes, first I wanted to say I'm not actually a Republican. I'm a conservative, but, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Are you a member of the Republican Party?
I'm not a member. I vote for Republicans, so I'll just leave it at that. But just because they're better than the Democrats. But anyway, I wanted to comment on immigration, and I think that what is happening in that regard is going to lead to the destruction of this country. We have really, over the Biden presidency, millions and millions of people who have crossed the border. I'm not saying they're bad people. They want a better life. But the Biden administration is redistributing them all across the country. We don't know who a lot of them are. They are coming from countries all over the world, and a lot of them can't sustain themselves. We're printing tons of money to put them up in housing, and this is costing billions of dollars, and that's increasing inflation, which is horrible under this president. And I just think that these people, good as they may be, they have no connection to our heritage, our history, our traditions. They don't understand our constitutional system. They don't speak our language, a lot of them. I just don't understand how a nation, and I saw a report that the Biden administration is flying them in by the hundreds of thousands with taxpayer money. How does this help our country? And I think they need to be deported, and Trump needs to win, and they need to all be sent back to their home countries. There's nothing wrong with that.
Karen in Pennsylvania, Democrats line. You are next up. Go ahead.
Hi. I have very, very rarely agreed with Samuel Alito. However, that flag was put up right after January 6th, or right after the hearings. I forget which one. But that's the exact message that needed to be sent, because if anybody looks at the real footage, the C-SPAN footage of January 6th and not Fox's version, they'll see that this country is in distress, big time distress. And the Supreme Court, as far as I'm concerned, they're political. Somebody needs to lock them in a room with a dictionary and a thesaurus. They can't figure out what 9 pages of the Constitution mean between 9 people. It's ridiculous.
Okay, Karen, there in Pennsylvania, the Times of Israel reporting that the United Nations today, the Security Council, set to meet for an emergency session after the Rafah strike that was reported over the weekend. Also, the subhead saying that Spain, Norway, and Ireland to formally recognize the Palestinian state, saying it's justice for Palestinian people and the only way for peace in the region. The story goes on to say that the emergency meeting was convened today, over that Israeli strike targeting Hamas operatives so that they reportedly killed dozens in a displaced persons camp in Rafah, and also says that the attack prompted a wave of international condemnation, with Palestinians and many Arab countries calling it a massacre. Israel said it was looking into, quote, tragic mishap. So that will be at the UN Security Council today. We hear from Ronald next. Ronald in Ohio, independent line.
Hello, Pedro.
Hi, you're on.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to talk about how the president always. Hello?
You're on. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. How the president always celebrate Memorial Day when all the veterans of all the wars should get free health care. All the congressmen and senators get free health care.
They damn
Why
sure
can't
do.
the veterans, if they care so much about the veterans,
Why don't they get all free health care?
that's my question.
Ronald there in Ohio. One of the things, by the way, internationally, if you're interested in the topic of Russia, that will take place at 10:30 this morning. Discussion taking a look at sanctions that the United States has placed on Russia and the effectiveness of those sanctions. It will feature former NSC National Security Council official Fiona Hill and others talking about that. It's sponsored by the Brookings Institution. Starts at 10:30 this morning. You can watch it on this channel. You can watch it on the app and the .org as well, if you're interested in learning more about that topic. Again, let's hear from Mary, or we'll hear from Mary in South Carolina, Democrats line. Hi.
Hi, good morning, Pedro. Your channel is the only channel that make me cry. Yesterday, your service that you showed program on the Veteran Memorial Day, it brought something back to me about our flag. The United States flag reminds me of the Bold Eagle, what we stand for, their symbols. And when I thought about, I think that really made me cry yesterday, was what Donald Trump said about our soldiers, trying to keep it together now, when he called them suckers and losers. That bothers me till this day. And yesterday, it all brought it back from what he said about our military soldiers that passed and fought for this country. I believe there should be a law for hanging our flags upside down and burning them. There should be a penalty for that. This flag stands for something in this country. Our Bald Eagle stands for something in this country. And we should not take it lightly. If you don't like what's going on, then leave. You don't have to stay here. If you think our government is so bad and so terrible that you can hang a flag upside down and burn them in the street, something is wrong with this country. The people that follow Donald Trump, he has no respect for our military service people. When you can call them losers and suckers, Donald Trump, you're the losers and your followers are your suckers.
Mary there in South Carolina. We will hear from Brandon, Republican line. He's in Columbus, Ohio.
Good morning.
You're on. Go ahead.
I just wanted to just share, just a little bit. I could go on for hours, but I'm not. I just want to talk a little bit about the State of the Union. Today is something that should have never occurred as far as the right wing or left wing and having basically transformed our nation from a republic to a nation to a democracy to a bipartisan forum for whoever hates whoever. And the worst thing about it is the fact that having parties just pushes us more and more towards a America where it doesn't matter who that you vote for, it just matters what party. And bipartisanship just eliminates the democratic process because there's only two parties to vote for. They should eliminate the parties, and if you are elected
elected from which party you should be president. And if you get second, you should be vice president. It should be that easy. But instead, we're stuck in the state that we're in.
Okay, Brandon there in Ohio. Let's hear from Richard in California, Democrats line.
Hi, Pedro. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Go ahead.
Pedro, you're looking good. I wanted to say a couple things real fast about Donald Trump and his campaign and so on. I want to mention, if possible, Kellyanne Conway, the lady who got him in the first place and engineered his original election. I would also like to mention her husband, George, and her daughter, 16 years old, who attempted to emancipate from her because of her activity with Donald. She wrecked her marriage. And Margaret Hoover. Many may not be aware of her. I would like to read to you from the dictionary the definition of fascism. According to the wiki definition, fascism's extreme authoritarianism and nationalism often manifest as a belief in racial purity or a master race, usually blended with some variant of racism, discrimination against a demonized other, such as Jews, homosexuals, ethnic minorities, or immigrants. That's the wiki definition. Yesterday, or Sunday actually, Conway, Kellyanne's husband, was on Margaret Hoover's show. She does a nice show every Sunday. And he referred to Donald as a similar to Adolf Hitler kind of person, a fascist. And I am fearful that we will lose our Constitution, as are many prominent Republicans, not to mention others, who they fear fascism. We fought World War II against fascism. We just did Memorial Day to honor those who gave up their lives to fight fascism. And I just can't stand it. This is just a terrible situation. The world needs to hear the word fascism against Donald Trump, because he's a wannabe fascist, in my not-so-humble opinion. And people should watch Margaret Hoover. She does a great show.
Okay, Richard there in California. Let's hear from another Richard. Richard in Pennsylvania, Republican line.
Yes, listening this morning, a lot of the same theme. We have to stop listening to the lies that are out there. Basically what has happened is we're listening to one man who's a demagogue. I'm a Republican. The Republican Party is no longer the party that it was. It's the party of Trump. But the lies are what's killing us. And people are struggling just to live their lives, and we got to stop listening to this BS that's out there. And I hear it all the time. Hear it on this show as well. So please don't lose our democracy. That's the main thing. Don't listen to the lies. Listen to reason. Thanks.
One story to point you at USA Today before we go. It's their front page story, Arming Cartels. Subhead saying U.S. shop smugglers tied to recover guns in Mexico. They say a massive leak of Mexican military intelligence has exposed for the first time in 2 decades U.S. gun shops and smugglers tied to 78,000 firearms recovered south of the border and which types of guns are being trafficked. The nuggets of information are among roughly 10 million records hacked by an anonymous collective known as the Guacayama and shared with news outlets under the Transparency Organization, by the Transparency Organization, distributed denial of secrets. The Mexican Defense Ministry leak previously made headlines for exposing military corruption and surveillance abuse. Despite efforts to stem the flow, the firearms are smuggled south as part of a cycle of Latin American narcotics headed north. The violence in Central America, fueled in part by guns, also has contributed to the migration crisis at the U.S. border. Part of a large story there. USA Today has it if you want to find it online at their website. Our final guest this morning on the program will be the former New York Lieutenant Governor Betsy McCaughey. She is the chair of an organization known as the Committee to Reduce Infectious Deaths. We'll talk about those efforts to combat health care to acquired infections. Also take a look at the overall state of health care. She'll join us next when Washington Journal continues.
C-SPAN has been delivering unfiltered congressional coverage for 45 years. Here's a highlight from a key moment.
To my colleagues, my friends, and most especially my wife and family, I have hurt you all deeply, and I beg your forgiveness. I was prepared to lead our narrow majority as Speaker, and I believe I had it in me to do a fine job. But I cannot do that job or be the kind of leader that I would like to be under current circumstances. So I must set the example that I hope President Clinton will follow. I will not stand for Speaker of the House on January 6th, but rather I shall remain as a backbencher in this Congress that I so dearly love for approximately 6 months into the 106th Congress, whereupon I shall vacate my seat and ask my governor to call a special election to take my place.
C-SPAN, powered by cable. C-SPAN Now is a free mobile app featuring your unfiltered view of what's happening in Washington, live and on demand. Keep up with the day's biggest events with live streams of floor proceedings and hearings from the U.S. Congress, White House events, the courts, campaigns, and more from the world of politics, all at your fingertips. You can also stay current with the latest episodes of Washington Journal and find scheduling information for C-SPAN's TV networks and C-SPAN Radio, plus a variety of compelling podcasts. C-SPAN Now is available at the Apple Store and Google Play. Scan the QR code to download it for free today, or visit our website, cspan.org/cspan now. C-SPAN Now, your front row seat to Washington, anytime, anywhere.
Washington Journal continues.
Betsy McCoy served as the former lieutenant governor in the state of New York from 1995 to 98. She is the founder and chairman of the Committee to Reduce Infection Deaths, and joining us to talk about infections, particularly those in the U.S. healthcare system, healthcare-acquired infections. Thank you for joining us and giving us your time this morning.
I am thrilled with this opportunity because at RID we have so much information that we're eager to share with patients and families. So much you can do to protect yourself from hospital infections. And just to give you some idea of the size of this problem, Pedro, nearly 100,000 people a year, and that's a very conservative CDC estimate, it's probably quite a bit larger, die from hospital-acquired infections you get after you go into the hospital. And these infections are largely preventable, and that's why I founded RID. But right now, these infections kill more people than AIDS, plus breast cancer, plus auto accidents combined. That gives you some extent of the size of this problem.
When did you become first aware of it?
Well, ironically, when I was lieutenant governor, people came to me with many kinds of health problems. I got so much mail every day. People even sent me x-rays. But increasingly, it was this one version or another of the same problem. Letters saying, I took my mother to the hospital, or maybe it was my father or my brother or my child, and they contracted a deadly infection. So when I left office in 1998, I vowed to do something about it. I spent quite a bit of time reading in the journals at the medical library. There are several journals devoted exclusively to hospital-acquired infections. And it was clear to me that we have the knowledge to prevent most of these infections. What has been lacking is the will. And that's why I founded RID. And we're really patient-centered. We, of course, provide a lot of information to hospitals and caregivers, training manuals and videos. But our major focus is on putting in the hands of patients and families the steps they can take to protect themselves. Let me give you an example of what causes these infections. If I were to ask you, what is the single biggest factor determining who gets an infection? What would you say? Is it their age? No. Is it the illness that brought them into the hospital? No. Surprisingly, the single biggest factor determining which patients get an infection is the room they're assigned to or the bed they're placed in. If they're put in a room and a preceding patient had an infection, even weeks before, their risk goes way up because that preceding patient was discharged, but their germs weren't. They're still on the bed rail, on the over-the-bed table, on the privacy curtain, on the doorknobs, on the television monitor, on the call button next to your bed. So the obvious answer is that inadequate cleaning is a major cause of these infections. The Columbia School of Nursing did a study a couple of years ago that showed that if you're put in a room where the immediately preceding occupant had an infection, your risk goes up 583%. That's almost sixfold. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus or vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus or Clostridium difficile or so many other of those bad boys in the hospital. Your risk goes way, way up.
If I may ask, wouldn't hospitals, by and large, have protocols for cleaning and such so this kind of thing wouldn't happen?
I'm glad you asked that. The fact is, cleaning is inadequate. And I'll give you an example. Michael Perry, Dr. Michael Perry, who's head of infectious diseases at Stanford Hospital in Connecticut, and Philip Carlin from Boston, two really highly regarded epidemiologists, did a study of 1,100 hospital rooms from Washington through Trenton, Jersey City, New York, Stamford, Connecticut, New Haven, Providence to Boston, 1,100 hospital rooms in some of the premier institutions, and found that over half the surfaces in those rooms that are supposed to be cleaned when one patient is discharged and the next one is brought in, that's called terminal cleaning, those surfaces were overlooked by the cleaners. So, in fact, they found that the one surface, well, I'll give it to you this way. If you need to eat your lunch in a hospital room, the safest place to put your sandwich is on the toilet seat. They never overlook that. But other parts of the room, they often overlook. So there needs to be much more rigorous cleaning. They've developed ways to do that. For example, at Rush Medical College in Chicago, they use a kind of goo they put on every surface. It only appears with a fluorescent light, so they can go into a room after it's cleaned and identify the surfaces that were overlooked, and then work with the cleaners to make sure that they don't overlook those surfaces in the future. It's often true that cleaners want to do a good job, but they're hesitant to get too close to the patient, or they're worried about time. They're often rushed because hospitals want to turn these rooms over quickly. So we need to do much more thorough cleaning.
Dan, let me ask you about the organization, the committee that you founded. You're founder and chairman, but if I understand it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have a medical background, so who do you depend on to come up with your information?
Oh, well, almost everyone on our board is a very recognized physician. We have Dr. Jeffrey Bohr, a premier cardiologist from New York Hospital, Dr. Jeffrey Moses from Columbia University Hospital, also a cardiologist. We have the premier back surgeon from Hospital for Special Surgery. We have Dr. Michael Perry from Stanford, who is part of the Columbia system. He's an epidemiologist and head of infection control. I could go on and on. We have a really strong roster of physicians who are closely involved in our efforts.
Betsy McCoy joining us for this conversation, the Committee to Reduce Infection Deaths. And if you want to ask her questions, it's the lines are different this time. It's 202-748-8000 for the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-748-8001 for the Mountain and Pacific time zones. And then if you are a medical professional, you want to give your comment or at least your perspective on this topic, 202-748-8002. You can always text us at 202-748-8003. Ms. McCoy, you talked about the surfaces and things like that, but what about the people involved? If they're part of the transmission problem, assumingly, how do you correct that, or at least what can be done to correct that?
Well, hand hygiene is incredibly important, and fortunately now, as opposed to 20 years ago when we founded RID, hand hygiene is very much emphasized in the hospitals. Some hospitals even have ways of detecting which members of the staff fail to clean their hands in between patients. It used to be 50% of the time. It's much less now. We've seen across the board a dramatic increase in rigorous hand hygiene and that's important. And we have to keep stressing and reminding people of those protocols. I was in a doctor's office just the other day with a patient and a dermatologist, and he came into the room, the dermatologist, he cleaned his hands, put on his gloves, but then after he examined something on the patient's face, he turned around and moved the chair away with his gloved hands, and then he wanted to touch the patient's wound again. And I said, oh, please change your gloves. So we have to constantly emphasize these protocols so that caregivers, even though the most meticulous, don't contaminate their hands by touching surfaces in the caregiving room or by failing to clean their hands before they pull those gloves out of the box and put them on. Let me give you a couple of other dramatic examples of how important this is. Robert Ornstein at the Mayo Clinic was very concerned with the most common hospital infection. The nickname is C. diff, Clostridium difficile. It's the only very common infection that patients contract orally rather than in some other way. C. diff spores are invisibly contaminating virtually all the surfaces in hospitals. And when patients touch those surfaces and then they get their meal tray or somebody brings them a box of cookies, they pick up the food with their hands, which are already contaminated with the spores, and they ingest the spores along with their food. If they're on antibiotics, it's particularly a problem because the antibiotics have killed some of the valuable flora and they kill C. diff. So C. diff gets started and it's a very devastating infection, causes rampant, sometimes lethal diarrhea and damage to the colon. So anyway, Robert Ornstein decided he would experiment at the Mayo Clinic, and he found that if he wiped the surfaces, what are called the high-touch surfaces, right around the patient's bed once a day with a Clorox bleach wipe, it reduced C. diff 86%. 86%. That suggests how powerful the hospital environment is in causing the transmission of these bacteria. Another example.
We have some calls for you if you want to take some calls. This is Patricia in New Jersey. You're on with our guest, Betsy McCoy. Patricia, go ahead.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Good morning, Betsy. Thank God for you. Hello, America. You are definitely telling the truth, and I just want to share. I had a brother who had heart disease. He was in a nursing home in Philadelphia, and we had to go in there and clean his room every day. Not that it was dirty, but I'm 68 now, and I remember hospitals being antiseptic. I mean, absolutely antiseptic. You can't even go to the bathrooms in the hospital. My mom, she had a 3-week stay in a big major hospital. They did great work. But I had to go in there and clean her room every day. You're right. The bathroom gets clean. But I tell you, the doors, the baseboards, the under the bed, and I was like feeling some kind of like, wow, we need to speak up about this. But there you are. Thank God for you. I don't know what to do. Things are changing in America, but that's a serious issue. That is a serious issue.
That's Patricia there in New Jersey.
Patricia, I just want to tell you that your parents are very lucky to have you to go to the hospital every day and clean up for them. God bless you. That is really wonderful. You mentioned long-term care, and although at the beginning our focus was on hospital-acquired infections, we are also trying to battle infections in nursing homes. And these long-term care facilities, well, I won't call them long-term care because often people are discharged from the hospital and they go to a subacute care facility like a nursing home, perhaps just for 3 weeks or so before they go home. And it's really important to be aware of what to do to protect yourself from infection in these nursing homes as well, because the infection rates in the nursing homes are about 3 times higher than in the hospitals. Why is that? Well, they have less staff, they're overburdened,
and they're not
staff
cleaning.
Turns over quickly, and they're not as well trained. So we've tried very hard to provide training for those staff members. We go to the nursing homes free of charge and give them a course on how to reduce infection risk for their patients. But we also have this brochure that you can have. You come to our website, hospitalinfection.org. Hospital infection, that thing you don't want to get, .org. We have 15 steps you can take before and during your hospital stay, and then, I just dropped it, 10 steps for when you're choosing a post-acute care facility. And this is really important because when you're in the hospital, if you're the patient or a family member, the social worker will come around before discharge and say, you know, Mrs. Jones, we don't think you're ready to go home. We'd like to put you in a nursing home for 2 weeks. Well, they are by law prohibited from recommending one versus the other. They're just going to send you to wherever there's a bed available. But we've made a list of things to look for so that when you do get to a nursing home, you've chosen the right one. For example, you want to go to a nursing home where they're very meticulous about avoiding pressure ulcers, also called bed sores. You want to make sure that they have the proper mattresses that constantly adjust your weight so that the pressure is not on the same part of your body at all times. You want to make sure that they turn the patients rapidly according to a schedule to make sure that the pressure isn't on one part of your body. Excuse me. That they have wedges for your heels and foam wedges to put in between your knees. So that's one thing. Another thing to look for if you're choosing a nursing home is to make sure that they provide proper oral care. That is cleaning of the inside of your mouth and your teeth every day. Because when patients are in a hospital or a nursing home and they sit there day after day and no one brushes their teeth and cleans the roof of their mouth and their tongue, bacteria build up and then it hardens like a shell and it flakes off. And then when you aspirate it, that's what's called aspirational pneumonia, which is a very common infection in the hospitals.
Ms. McGuire, we have another call for you. This is Bob in New Hampshire. Hello.
Hi, Bob.
Hello, how you doing? Betsy, I have a question. But first, I was on the Affordable Care Act for catastrophic. I was very happy with that. Went on to Medicare. I was very happy with that. I was always thinking that Medicare Advantage was against Medicare, so it was like trying to take things away. But I went under Medicare Advantage. I can name you the company. I'm very happy with that. But my question is Medicare Advantage, the private companies, are they taken away from Medicare? I read that they were actually more efficient. Medicare wanted to go under Medicare Advantage. That was my question.
Well, Medicare Advantage, my twin brother's on Medicare Advantage, so we often have this discussion. I'm smiling just thinking about it. Bill and I talk about this often. So Medicare Advantage is very good for some people. If you're generally very healthy and you want those extra perks that Medicare Advantage provides, sometimes it's a gym membership or dental care or eyeglasses, it's a really good deal. On the other hand, if you have serious problems like you have cancer in your family or you have a history of chronic illnesses, you might prefer to stay with regular Medicare because Medicare Advantage has limits on which doctors you can use and which hospitals you can use. That's kind of a simple explanation for the differences.
There's a viewer from X asking this question, saying, where can we find local information about how our local hospitals are doing in preventing infection?
I'm so glad you asked that, because one of the things that RID has done for many years, when I founded RID 20 years ago, not one state required hospitals to disclose their infection rates. Now we're up to 37. And if you come to our website, part of the website will show you how to find the hospital infection rates for the hospitals in your own area, because in most states that information is now publicly available and we have links to it. So please come to our website and we'll show you how to do it.
Is there a degree in which infection rates are tolerable versus one that you have concerns over?
Well, first of all, there should be in an ideal world, there should be almost no infections. I will say that some types of pneumonia are really related to aging and almost unavoidable. But surgical site infections, catheter-related infections, they're preventable through proper protocols and meticulous cleaning. So I would like to see very low infection rates. And I would like to see more emphasis on disclosure. For example, excuse me for coughing, in England, they put the cleanliness rating of the hospital right on the front door, A, B, C, or D. In America, we do that for restaurants, but you can go home and make your own dinner. It's more important to know that information for hospitals.
Ms. McCoy, you talked about some of those infection sites. You talked about with bloodstream and surgical site, but with the use of ventilators, particularly commonplace within a hospital, what's the risk of infection due to that?
Well, ventilator-associated pneumonia is a serious problem. We saw a lot of that during COVID when so many people were unfortunately on ventilators. And there are things that can be done to reduce the risk of ventilator-associated pneumonia. We have a lot on our website about that. A lot of it's quite technical, but very important. But here are things, let me tell you a few things that you can do as individuals before and during your hospital stay. For example, don't shave. If you're going into the hospital, don't shave your face, your legs, any part of your body. Shaving creates nicks in the skin through which bacteria can enter, so shaving is like putting out a welcome mat for infection. Another thing, if you're having most types of surgery, a hip replacement, a knee replacement, cardiac surgery, if you bathe for 3 days in a row with chlorhexidine, that's a type of soap. There are many brands, many different brands, Hibiclens, Betasept, etc. But if you bathe with this type of liquid soap for 3 days before your surgery, it removes the dangerous bacteria from your own skin that could migrate into your surgical incision and cause a nasty infection. That was proven at many different hospitals. New England just did a very important study on that. And that's part of our 15 steps you can take to reduce your risk of a hospital infection. Actually, I should just mention this. We've also created a kit that has in it everything you need, all the tools mentioned in our 15 steps are in this kit. We've started offering this. We don't make any money on this, or I wouldn't raise this issue. But this kit has the small size bottle of chlorhexidine soap in it and many other things you need during your stay to reduce your risk of infection, even stickers to put on your hospital gown that say, please clean your hands before treating me. So you'll find this on the website. It's made by LifeVac, a wonderful company that also makes those devices to prevent children from choking.
If I may ask then, the committee, where does it get its funding?
Pardon me?
Where does the committee get its funding?
From donations from individuals.
And any medical community, anybody associated with the pharmaceutical industry?
No big corporations. It's all just individuals who, through the goodness of their heart, donate.
North Dakota's next. This is Margaret joining us. You're on with our guest, Margaret. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm so glad to talk to you. When my mother was in the hospital she had a heart attack, and when she was in there a few days, there was a hole in the back of the calf of her leg, and you could drop an egg in it. It was that huge, and I'd like to know, how did she get something like that? Because then when they discharged her, I had a sister-in-law that would have to come up and, clean her hole, with this dressing. And when I saw that, my heart just dropped. I don't understand how something like that happened.
Oh, well, I wish I could tell you. I don't know whether you're talking about a central line. Sometimes when people are very ill, they have a central line and it creates a hole. But I'm sorry that they sent your mother home without adequately preparing you or sending her to a nursing home where her wound could be cared for.
Carrie, in Milwaukee, you are up next for our guest. Carrie, good morning.
Good morning. One thing I would just like to add before I get to my question, the difference between traditional Medicare and Medicare Advantage. Again, if you're healthier, like I am, luckily, Medicare has no out-of-pocket limit. So people could, need to file bankruptcy with that. The Medicare Advantages typically have, $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 maximum out-of-pocket limit. So that's a big one. But, however, Medicare Advantage for many procedures requires prior authorization, which can be difficult to get sometimes, whereas Medicare, you can get anything you want. Anyhow, to my question for your guest right now.
Let me just say thank you for adding that. I should have added that, and I really appreciate that addition.
Absolutely. Question for you. I think you said your organization is about 20 years old. You've been talking today about all the things that we as patients can do to help keep ourselves and our loved ones from getting infections. I imagine earlier on in your 20-year history, you probably thought, well, let's help the hospitals or encourage the hospitals to do better cleaning from that sense, because you said the cleaning is just not done. What sort of pushback did you get from the medical community on that?
A lot. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, I have gotten a lot of pushback. And let me give you an example. It's not just me personally. But, for example, there are now several technologies available.
I'm going to say that, my mother was in a nursing facility at the end of her life also. And the day that my mother passed away, they had lost her teeth. I hadn't been to see her in about 3 days because I had gotten some kind of fever, cold, whatever. But I couldn't go as long as I was contagious. And honestly, I never went to see my mother in a facility because she just didn't want to be there. I'm not sure as to how public services operate, but I do know every time my mother went into a nursing facility, within 3 days, her skin had broken on her behind and she had open bed sores. Just within 3 days. And I'm kind of happy I don't have another parent to lose, as that is the most distressful process, to give your loved one to a nursing facility that really doesn't provide loving care. But it is our personal obligation. This is her journey. Her name is Betsy McGillicuddy or something. McCaughey. Betsy. And her organization is Healthcare Acquired Infections. No, she's a founder of something. I have to turn off so I can see it. Okay. Betsy and the Committee to Reduce Infections Deaths. That's her organization. She's founded it. And in America, anybody can found a committee or an organization to help do the work of America if you live within a state, a territory, a county, as it is we the people who make a difference. Every day I try to wake up and invest in myself by listening to others who conversate, but we have to understand what we have given ourselves over to. A system of people who are training people based on their life experience, and that's public education. I also find it amazing that so many people would pretend to understand what they don't know because they have been assigned a position of power. And we call that house and field. In the Black community, house Negro and the field Negro is how we see it. But you can only tell me something if you have experienced it. And as there is an 88% population of Negro children here in Nevada, Clark County, Viva Las Vegas juvenile facility is holding 88% African American children. And the state of Nevada entered into a partnership with Molina Health in order to address the needs of the children who are incarcerated. And now they are rushing to build a behavioral hospital. Because somebody very smart figured that they got caught by sending children over 1,000 miles away from their homes because they had mental health issues. And what the feds told them is that that was cruel and unusual, and that they needed to have more flexibility and provide services closer to the children's home. Therefore, it wouldn't violate those children's rights to rebuild relationships. There's just so much to know in America and so little time. But the little time we have should be utilized in providing the mission of whatever your journey was when you were born, as everybody has a journey. What's your life journey? Let's finish hearing Betsy, please.
Filthy, laden with bacteria, so the caregiver's hands are clean before they ever reach the patient's bed. So you are quite right. There needs to be much more training in envisioning where the bacteria are and what needs to be done to prevent that bacteria, because it's almost all bacteria, from getting to the patient.
You talk about a patient's room, but what about if a patient has to go get an x-ray or go to therapy or things like that? How does that complicate the problem?
Very smart, Pedro. It complicates the problem a lot. You know, there are some countries where a wheelchair, for example, you don't just use a wheelchair and then push it out into the hallway for somebody else to use. It's thoroughly disinfected, and wheelchairs used by people who are positive for certain types of bacteria aren't allowed to be used for anybody else. But in this, unfortunately, there's too often here just a indiscriminate use of medical technology. I'll tell you an interesting story. There was an outbreak of a infection down in Galveston, Texas, in a burn unit in the hospital. Infection called vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, VRE. And they spent a lot of time researching how this infection traveled because, you know, burn victims are so fragile. And they finally identified that the culprit was an EKG wire, kind of wire that you lay across somebody's chest with those little. So here's the punchline. The last patient to be treated with that wire had been discharged 37 days earlier. That's how long the bacteria can live on a piece of medical equipment. It's inside the blood pressure cuffs that are rolled from room to room. Always have the caregiver put the cuff around your garment or clean the inside of it, so you aren't picking up the bacteria from the preceding patient's arm.
We'll hear next from Pennsylvania. That's where Linda is for our guest, Betsy McCoy. Linda, good morning.
Good morning. I love this girl that's on. I got one good question. Now, most of your rooms in the hospital have their own blood pressure cuff right on the wall.
Yeah.
Doctor has his own stethoscope. Years I was at the hospital, I never saw that doctor wipe down that stethoscope. From this patient to this patient.
Okay, Linda there in Pennsylvania.
Yes, stethoscopes can be vectors for disease. Now they make caps. Some people use those, but the easiest is just to wipe it off with an alcohol swab, alcohol pad before the next patient. That will kill the bacteria, and caregivers should do that. They should always clean the flat part of the stethoscope before using it on the next patient.
In Virginia, Stanton, Virginia. David, hello.
Hello, C-SPAN. Thank you for taking my call. I have a couple questions. I know she mentioned UV lights in the hospital that they use occasionally. there's a UV light advertised pretty often now for people in their home. Is that effective, you think? I know you're not supposed to be in there very long when the UV light's on.
Yeah, UV light is not good. UV light is effective at killing germs, but it is toxic. And so I wouldn't recommend UV light. I don't even recommend it in the hospital. I think there are better things. There are two problems with UV light in the hospital. First, you have to empty the room. And secondly, UV light doesn't go around corners or under beds or behind things. So some of the other products that are now available, misting products or hydrogen peroxide products, are better because they don't depend on the line of sight.
Caller, did you have a follow-up question?
Follow-up question. This is more of a medical question. About a month ago, I came down with cellulosis, which is a bacterial disease under the skin, right? And so the treatment was antibiotics. But for some reason, I was only allowed to take 2 courses of antibiotics. What's wrong with continuing antibiotics or using a different antibiotics if some of the symptoms are still there?
David in Virginia, thanks for the question.
Well, of course, right now there's such an emphasis on what they call antibiotic stewardship. But if you still have the problem, please see the doctor again, because they may have given you the wrong antibiotic to address the particular bacterium affecting you.
Suzanne is in Ohio, in Cincinnati. Good morning.
Good morning. If someone is looking at possibly having surgery, and your doctor does it either in a hospital or at a freestanding surgery center, which would you recommend?
Freestanding surgery center. Now, of course, there are many variables. I can't compare exactly because I don't know which freestanding surgery center and which hospital. But in general, it's better to be in a place where there aren't a lot of sick people.
To that end, Ms. McCoy, then what do you think about the growth of freestanding health clinics across the United States? Do they pose the same degree of problem, say, within a concentrated place like a hospital?
Well, I'm talking about surgery here. Freestanding health clinics, of course, it depends on the abilities and of the professionals who are providing services in those freestanding clinics. But we've looked carefully at freestanding surgery centers, and the big advantage they have, assuming all other things are equal, is that you don't have a lot of sick people there. So you can really control the overall level of bacteria living inside the institution. There are a lot of really bad bugs living in hospitals that you don't find anyplace else. Candida auris, things like that. You never hear about those germs anywhere else except in a hospital.
And is that just because of the in and out nature of a hospital, or are there other specific causes?
No, it's because people who come to the hospital are very sick. Once somebody comes in with something, Candida auris happens to be a very serious fungal disease. And once it gets into a hospital, it's hard to control it. It gets into the ceiling tiles. It gets into the equipment. It's very deadly. I mean, Candida auris bloodstream infections has a 50% mortality rate. So when a hospital gets hit with a germ like that, it's a serious problem. You don't hear about that in freestanding surgery centers.
Here's a viewer off of X asking you, or they start by saying, I read a book about the importance of relatively simple checklists. They help reduce infections, but there was resistance and a lot to do with the arrogance of some physicians, especially surgeons.
How true. Of course, there's arrogance in all professions. I have a great deal of respect for people in the medical profession, but as with any other profession, there are some people who think they know it all and don't want to hear more. But if you're going to see a surgeon, ask a list of questions. Ask them about screening you, swabbing your nasal passages, your skin, your groin for bacteria before you go in for surgery. Because doing those swabs, you can identify if your own skin has dangerous bacteria, it can migrate into your surgical incision. They'll give you mupirocin for your nose. They'll encourage you to bathe with chlorhexidine for 3 days, so that when you go in for surgery, you're optimizing the opportunity to get that surgery without an infection.
Ms. McCoy, because you've had some experience with the federal government over your years in political service, has the Department of Health and Human Services ever tackled this issue of bacterial infection within a hospital?
Well, I would say, honestly,
No.
the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, could do much more. That agency, unfortunately, is suffering from a lot of mission confusion. Instead of focusing on their original mission, stopping infectious diseases, they now are involved in everything from auto accidents to smoking, all good causes. But they really need to focus on asking hospitals to do more to protect patients from infection.
One more call. This will be from Leo in Illinois. Go ahead, please.
C-SPAN for having guests on. It's somebody who thinks like us.
Leo, you're cutting in and out. Can you try getting closer to your device, please?
Okay. How's that?
Go ahead, please.
My question is, what do you think about the overcrowding of the emergency rooms? That's my question.
Thank you, Leo.
Hey, I didn't hear the word before emergency rooms. What was it, Pedro?
He said overcrowding in emergency rooms.
Okay, well, overcrowding, it's a problem. People go to the emergency room for several reasons. The major users of emergency rooms are elderly people. They're what we call the frequent flyers, and it's because they truly have emergencies. Now, with so many people coming from the southern border, we also have many more newcomers, migrants who don't have insurance and don't know where else to go. They go to the emergency room. Emergency rooms are overcrowded. Some hospitals handle that well by sorting people out when they first come in to the true emergencies, and then people who need more basic services but don't know where else to go. But as long as I've been involved in this, emergency rooms have always been very crowded.
The Committee to Reduce Infection Deaths is Betsy McCoy's work as the founder and chairman. She previously served as the former lieutenant governor, Republican in New York from 1995 to 98. You can find the work of her organization at hospitalinfection.org. Ms. McCoy, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you so much. I hope it's been helpful to everyone watching.
And
That's
listening.
it for our program today. Another edition of Washington Journal comes your way tomorrow at 7 a.m. We'll see you then.
Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and I'm about to sign off. For a while, anyway, I'll be back. I just really want to talk about what's happening in every state across America, as we need to understand that there's zero accountability until you decide to be heard. What will you do in the year of 2024? I say,